Hello, and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from Just Rusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about complexity creep in game design and expansions like DLC or as ongoing or live service games add stuff to them. Just Rusty begins, I've been playing a lot of Against the Storm and Reyes 2 this month. Both games got big DLC expansions and came with a substantial patch to the base game as well. This parlay just has a bunch of specific questions now. In an ideal world for you, for me, Zandy, how much complexity creep should an expansion add to a game, if any? If a free update can reduce complexity while maintaining depth, should that complexity budget allowance also be filled by free content? Or is it better to keep the base game as simple as possible for new players? How would your answer change depending on the expected lifespan of ongoing support for a game? And then there's more, but we'll get into it a little later. Great, very simple, actionable questions that are really complicated to answer. Let's get started. We need definitions. So complexity versus depth, and then complexity creep. Let's do complexity versus depth first. So complexity, not necessarily bad. In many cases in normal life, complexity and depth are used interchangeably, and this makes sense. Here, it's going to be helpful to distinguish between them. So here, I am going to use complexity, I think the way you're using it too, Just Rusty, to mean the often literally just words you add to a game that make it harder to learn how the game works. And then the depth is the benefit in like interestingness, fun that you get from being able to think about the game in a myriad ways. Yes, increasing complexity usually increases depth. I hope it does, otherwise probably don't increase the complexity. Here we are treating complexity as the necessary evil to create some amount of depth. On the most basic level, it doesn't have to be actually complicated. You're just saying if I have a blank sheet of paper and we want to play a game together, I can create up from 0 to 0.0001% complexity, and that would be like I draw a 3x3 grid, and I say the rules are that you put an X or an O in each space on your turn, and it's tic-tac-toe. I added a tiny bit, barely any, the smallest amount I could possibly add, complexity, in exchange for some depth. Now a game does exist. Now it's not very much depth. You could argue there are games that are about as easy to explain as tic-tac-toe, but are deeper than tic-tac-toe. I would say Connect 4 is probably one of those. You could say Connect 4 is an example where it is more complex in that to understand the rules well enough to actually use them, you need to like think about it a little bit more, but explaining the rules is pretty simple, a similar amount of simple to tic-tac-toe, and you can play Connect 4 on a sheet of paper. You just draw in the think about the physics of the piece dropping and then like draw it in as if it had fallen, and then the depth you unlocked was, well, a lot more than tic-tac-toe, right? Tic-tac-toe can be a solved game by a 5-year-old, and so yeah, I Connect 4 you added some. I hope you'll agree. This is important. I'm trying to establish that when you trade complexity and depth, that is, you're trying to make a game, so you increase the complexity, again, not necessarily to make the game complex, but you increase the complexity slider by some amount, from 0 to 1, out of like a million or whatever, any amount. You get some amount of depth, but the amount of depth you get is not exactly proportional to the complexity you added. You can absolutely break parity on complexity and depth. And this is one of the primary things that makes a game good, is if it has a good parity break on complexity and depth. The rules are elegant, and yet the game is deep. You added complexity, but not very much for the amount of depth you added. This could also be done if the game is very complex. You could make a game that does have a lot of complexity, but relative to the amount of complexity you added, it's really, really, really deep. That is, there are similar games that are really deep, but they're usually more complicated, or similarly complicated games are usually less deep. So you can totally still do it if the game is very complex. Is a game that is of very little complexity, but has relatively good depth for its complexity, and a game that is very complex but has relatively good depth for its complexity of different value from each other, which one of them is better? That would be an interesting parlay to do. I don't know or care really. I feel like it's more just depth is cool, so it's the complexity is there when the person is ready for it, and one of your tasks, I think, as a game developer is to try to make the trade good so it's worth the effort for the person to learn about the game. And this isn't done as often as I'd like, but sure, it's not like nobody knows about this. I feel like board games are a really good place to see better attempts to trade complexity and depth in an effective way if you wanted to go looking. Board game culture has a real, I don't know, like cultural fear or memory of people coming to game night and just bouncing off the rules of a game. And I find this very annoying. I feel like it's sort of a factor of people not having friends that like have actually thought about whether they like the same thing as their other friends. And you can have a life where this isn't a problem. That's all I'm trying to say. But I also think it's true on the other end that a lot of the people suggesting the complicated game just don't care whether it's complicated and will accept any complexity for like not a particularly good trade in depth. So I blame both parties. You both suck. It's good to care about that. I think board games largely do often care about that. Board game designers, board game developers. But that's complexity and depth, at least the way I see them for this parlay. You're trading some amount of like literally just rules a lot of the time, words, for some amount of like fun or interesting decisions the player can make, and you want that trade to be in favor of the depth. Again, in normal parlance, complexity can be good in other ways, but for the most part, it's just bad here. There will be some asterisks to that. So what is complexity creep? This is very simply the phenomenon that if you make a game, you probably, if you thought about this at all, which most people do, they don't make rules that are more complicated than they think is necessary to achieve the game design that they want. That is, they don't add more complexity than they think is necessary to get the depth that they want. So if you've done that, and you've been fairly thorough in fleshing out the game, if you add stuff, you probably need to add complexity, because all of the best deals on complexity to depth have been taken already. Thus, you get complexity creep. This is not bad in the sense that it doesn't mean that automatically, if the game wasn't built around these trades for complexity to depth that you added, that they're going to be bad. You could absolutely make a game, and I think a lot of games are like this, where the basic form of the game is a good system for trading complexity and depth. And therefore, yes, the first expansion pack of trading cards is less complicated than the next, but you could argue that the next set is actually a better trade of complexity to depth. It adds complexity but gains even more depth for a little while. And then at some point, if you keep making each expansion of the trading cards more and more complex, you're going to get to a point where you're always adding complexity, or hopefully not, but the trend will be you're adding complexity, but you will start running out of good trades to get complexity for depth. And eventually it's going to be that you aren't actually making the game much more deep. You might even be making it more shallow with power creep, put a pin in it for later in the parlay. But the game is still getting more complex. This is bad, and normally if you were trying to develop a game to just be good, you would stop here, but because money, which is going to come up a lot in this parlay, you probably won't stop and you'll instead keep making money. For any ongoing game or a game with a lot of DLC, you could even try to map out for yourself, not which expansions did you like or did other people like or which sold well. None of that really means anything in today's culture, but just which ones feel like an actually good compromise of game design materials, of complexity being exchanged for depth, a relatively good amount of depth for the amount of complexity. And this model means that ongoing games are absolutely doomed. That was probably clear to most people from the start, but will likely have a point somewhere in their lifespan, probably not at the beginning of their lifespan, where they are arguably the best design in a vacuum. If you were to sell them as a box game by themselves and not an ongoing game, a live service, at some point in their lifespan, which probably is not at the beginning, they are the best form of themselves. Same thing with a lot of games with DLC. At some point along the game adding DLC or updates, and that point probably isn't the base version with no DLC or updates, the game is arguably the best version of its design. It created a good design language. For some amount of time, there were good ways to add complexity, but get a lot of depth for the complexity, because the game had set up a system the player understood. But then that eventually wore off. I don't think this is always true. I think sometimes a game is its good form from the start. And when you think about it, that's what's kind of weird about this whole discussion, right? Like, if you design a game to have a good deal on complexity versus depth, and I was saying before, maybe you make a system or a language in the game that once you have those rules, you can create a lot of depth from them. And then if you add a little bit more, you do add a little complexity, but you created a lot of depth. You created a good system for adding complexity. So isn't the goal of game design to just do that from the start? And so why do games keep improving if you add a bunch of stuff to them? My basic answer for you is because money. Because a lot of the time, if you were to investigate, you would find that the DLC for the game is kind of not DLC from a developer perspective. They purposefully kept out things that they planned to be part of the game to sell them as a DLC later. I'm not making a comment on the financial or moral status of this action. I'm just saying it does literally happen a lot of the time, and I think that that explains why the game feels like more complete, not in its originally complete form, because that actually wasn't the version that they tried their hardest to make a good deal of complexity and depth for. One of the DLCs added to the game was secretly basically the intended base game. If that sounds conspiratorial to you, I'm not going to try that hard to convince you it isn't. You can look this up if you want to, but an example would be a lot of live service games nowadays purposefully launch early and let the last 6 months or whatever of their development just be the first 6 months of their updates, basically giving them some free time. The game is just barely complete enough, and they take its often some quality of life features. Looking at you, Monster Hunter Wilds, Genshin Impact. We could go on, let's not. But I'm sure more people, I don't play a lot of these games because they're usually bad. But I thought those two had good points despite some problems, and so sure. And they were very, very feature incomplete at launch, I would argue. A lot of players defend this by saying they want to like the game, so they want to defend it anyway. It's not bad to criticize games you like, but people don't realize this. And they see them as quality of life features. It's not part of the game to make it easier to click through the menus, but it just is, though. That's a thing you have to do to operate the game. In fact, it's one of the only things you have to do to operate the game. Genshin Impact for a while didn't have a thing that let you rebind buttons on controller, and had the thing where in some countries A and B are swapped in what they do. And so this is very confusing for people when the game is brought abroad. And that's perfectly fine. It's just a really simple thing to add in. The player has the ability to switch that. But they didn't for quite a long time, in my opinion, when the game first came out. This is Genshin Impact. These are examples where, yeah, you could say that the game, that's a little different from complexity to depth, but yeah, you could say the game was at its best after some DLC or after a few updates, but that's because that was actually the original completed version of the game, and the developer or the publisher are arguably just being kind of pedantic and insisting that that isn't the based version of the game, but it pretty much just is for all practical intents and purposes. So, yeah. So I'm going to come down pretty hard on DLC in many of these comments, but the reason is not because I somehow hate it or think it's all bad. It's just because I think that it usually is going to make a game in a vacuum a less ideal complexity to depth compromise. The goal of good game development is to get that compromise dialed in as good as you can right away. We're going to talk about a lot of things that could be seen as benefits of DLC. You can add on some complexity to depth progression that still stays within the band of depth that the game's game design actually works in. Or the game is so non-complex that it's kind of free to add a little complexity. I'll unpack these things in a minute. But I don't really see those as benefits of DLC because that would be the ideal goal of game design from the start. The question remains, if the game was made as good as it possibly could be from the start, but then you were just forced to add DLC, and you did this all as well as possible, would you want to do anything with complexity and depth? And I would say the short answer for me is no, of course not. The whole point of the game design is to hit the place where it feels good. You have a good compromise of complexity and depth. And if you've done a good job, you built the game to create that compromise. So changing it would inherently be bad unless you kind of already messed up, you could say, or it was already leaving something on the table. I will just say before I continue that I think the most common place where DLC to a game that the developer did everything in their power to make good ends up being good is when the developer obviously just noticed some new things once the game was out and in the wild and people were playing it that would have made the game better if they were baked in. I'm not trying to act like we're actually living and making games in a platonic meditation plane. I understand that in the real world, people just won't be able to figure out everything that would be good for the game's design, right? And so, of course, after the game comes out, you might notice things that actually do fit the complexity depth compromise that the game was going for really well, but you just didn't notice from the start. And so ideally, those are the kinds of things you add. I was just making the point that we all know, if we're being real, most games DLC is not like that. They're just trying to add things for money without messing the game up too much, or the developer isn't thinking very much about these compromises and just does things that feel right or fit the vibe, which, credit where credit's due, I feel like sometimes it goes surprisingly well, but ideally it would be that you'd be managing this equation. So let's actually answer these questions with those things in mind. How much complexity creep should an expansion add to a game, if any? Zero. Ideally, none at all. And it's not that complexity creep is inherently bad, though it mostly is, as I just defined it, because you're getting off of the track of the complexity to depth compromise that the game is built around. So it's gonna be bad to do that. That would be like saying, you put a lot of effort into deciding what type of racetracks are good for your racing game, but then you add some that are more complicated than you determined was a good fit for your game. That doesn't sound good. Why? Why did you do that? Or you made some that are more simple than what you had originally added to the game. There might be a good reason to do that. Maybe players said they wanted a really simple track to like test out cars on, or so. I don't know. I don't play this kind of game that much. Mario Kart, people want like a more entry level track to get used to drift based racing. I don't know. Sure. It's not as big of a thing in racing games. It's kind of good for tracks that have different complexity, but obviously within a band, right? And so you see my point. If you were to add some that had a very different complexity to depth compromise, then you spent the entire game's development concluding was a good fit for the game. It probably doesn't take much arguing to convince you that that would obviously be bad, like that, and it wouldn't be good. Or if it was good, you could argue that is kind of just a different game. And a lot of the time it will be that people who like the base game might not like that stuff, which, like, I guess that's fine, but that is arguably just a different game. And again, we come back to, because of money, there is an incentive to put that in the same game, even though it's arguably really not the same piece of game design. So this one is simple to me. How much complexity creep should an expansion add to a game, if any? I mean, ideally none. The sort of goal of game design is to dial in where this is a good compromise. So it would, of course, be bad, almost by definition, to add that into it. Now, this will become more complicated with these other questions. I think you structured these questions really well, just Rusty. The second one is, if a free update can reduce complexity while maintaining depth, just pause there. You can reduce complexity while maintaining depth. Very nicely done. Another way to look at this is, you found a really, really good complexity to depth compromise. Sometimes this might be something like a game launches and its tutorial is just not as good as it could be. And as players play the game, using their questions and confusion about the game and YouTuber videos that are a better tutorial, you make the tutorial better. You maintained all the depth that was there, but the complexity of the game in practice is just lower for players on the ground. Good job. Great. Okay, so that's really good. Fantastic. Kind of unlikely that you'd be able to do this, but it will happen sometimes. If when a free update can reduce complexity while maintaining depth, should that complexity budget allowance also be filled by free content? Or is it better to keep the base game as simple as possible for new players? It's better to keep the game as simple as possible for new players, but I mean, obviously it's insane to suggest that like no complexity is ever warranted, right? That there would be people for whom any game more complicated than tic-tac-toe they would not like. You'll meet people in the world who will insist that they indeed don't like any game more complicated than tic-tac-toe, but they're just wrong though. Like they don't know that, right? They haven't tried those games. It's okay to respect them and say you don't want to play games, cool, but like they're not magically somehow able to know that that's actually true either, right? We should just accept that they don't want to know. Okay, it's their life, but over here in game design land, we shouldn't consider that to be like, oh wow, a mystical species of person for whom that level of complexity just is the only thing they want. For the most part, no. I mean, that is low enough that basically everybody would, if they were willing to try it, prefer a little more complexity. And so, not to malign anyone's taste in games, but there is definitely something where there's like a minimum level of complexity above which, yes, eventually it gets complex enough that some people will reject the game in good faith, but below which there is a range where like you get a little bit, only a little bit, don't get too excited over there. Hey, put that down. No, only a little bit of kind of free complexity. Again, don't go to Vegas, like don't cash that check. We'll unpack it. But yes, I do feel like there is a tiny, okay? I don't know how many times I can say this. A very small amount of like arguably free complexity, where if you can make a game really, really simple, yeah, you can kind of add depth for free by adding a little bit of complexity. But again, it's sort of pointless because you still want to do the best job compromising complexity and depth as you possibly can, right? And so, yeah, like you're kind of just doing the same thing as before anyway. So does it really matter? I really don't want people to think in terms of like, oh, I could just make the game complex for free. This is like that thing in books where the author spends like the first 3 chapters dispensing exposition about the world because somebody told them that they should cash in their patience from the reader by dispensing the exposition early in the book. The reader bought the book or whatever, and so they have a little bit of time where the reader will just tolerate it. Like, they will, but the book would still be made monumentally superior if you did not take advantage of that and made the book as good as possible and efficient in that period, right? It's still much better to write as best as you can for that period of time and not just have a big ass exposition dump. It's not a license to make the game bad for that part. This is the same thing, right? So it sort of doesn't matter, but yeah, like, I guess there's a period where you can add a little complexity for no real compromise if the game is like very, very simple. I mean, this could also be for pacing too. You make the tutorial really good, and so it turns out you could probably introduce a few more elements earlier now. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a sec, because this is the other place that I feel like adding complexity back when you've created the Philosopher's Stone, transmuted lead into gold, and reduced complexity while maintaining depth. Adding complexity back, bad except for 2 reasons. The first one is, yes, if it's extremely low, there's kind of no need. But then the second one, which is connected, would be pacing, basically. I think if the game unfolds over time and there's a range in which the depth or difficulty or just like the amount of mechanics at one time that the player has can expand, but the game's design still works well. Yeah, most games are designed where the complexity and depth slowly rise over the course of the experience, like rather than falling over the course of the experience, right? If a game has its deepest points, they're going to be like later, not early, probably, hopefully, usually, right? I can think of games where that sort of isn't the case, but in many cases I would say it's sort of an accident, and the deepest point where the complexity hasn't gotten as high as it's going to get is usually the best part of the game. There are plenty of games, I think, where the complexity rises steadily for the duration of the game, maybe tapering off toward the end if you get used to everything you have, and the the depth might not peak at that same point. It might be that there is a place where the complexity to depth compromise is better than other times. You get a certain amount of tools in your toolkit, and at that moment, the game is kind of deeper than it will be when you get even more tools, but it is also a little less complex than it will be later when you get those more tools. And so for a little while, the game is maybe deeper at that point. ideally, in a perfect world, you would remake the game to be about that point, built around that point. You could extend it or lean into it a little. Maybe don't add that other stuff, or don't add it at the same time, or find a way to not add complexity while maintaining that depth. This might not often be done, but sure, having there be like a gradient, some motion through the complexity and depth of the game could be fine. And so if you reduce the complexity while maintaining depth, yes, there might be more room to create a fun ramp of gently rising complexity and increasing depth that would be longer. So maybe you'll make the game a little more complex at some other point and cash in that depth to create a kind of gradient for the player. Sure, lots of games do this with their progression. That's not that weird. But again, I would say that sort of boils down to pacing. So if a free update can reduce complexity while maintaining depth, should that complexity budget allowance also be filled by free content? No. Or is it better to keep the base game as simple as possible for new players? Yes, with the two exceptions of if the complexity is extremely low, it's kind of mostly free to add a little bit of complexity as long as it's a good deal for depth. And for pacing, yeah, often you might end up adding in relatively more complexity and depth overall, but just paced better throughout the game. That being said, I feel like people continue to underestimate, even the board game industry continues to underestimate how valuable reducing complexity, even at the cost of some depth, often is. Most games, in my opinion, are not a very good compromise of these two things. There's not that many games that I think are a very efficient conversion of complexity into depth, because there's more to life than doing such a thing. Fine, yeah, I agree about that. It's not really a problem for me, though that's why I notice this so much, because I see people bouncing off games and I go, I can just automatically assimilate all this information instantly because I'm a freak of nature, but like, they can't, and there isn't really a good reason they should have to. You could just make it simpler by doing this. And then sometimes I try to put that together. There have been times when board games or like a card game I've played with people, we've fiddled with the rules somewhat, and I feel like gained most of the game's interest while reducing some faffery with the game. And I think in many games this is not very hard. Now, sometimes what's happening is there's depth to the game we don't notice that comes from that complexity, and we lost it by removing those rules. But it is okay to lose some depth in games. I just want to say, I'm not trying to be hubristic and say, oh, I magically know everything about the game's design. I definitely don't. But just to say, it's also an overreaction to act like it's of the highest importance to make sure the game has every bit of depth it has. It's more important for people to have fun. It would just be nice if they could have all of the benefits as well. And so trying to get a good compromise would be good. Or not even a compromise. Trying to have your cake and eat it too would be good. How would your answer change depending on the expected lifespan of ongoing support for a game? Not at all. This is my central thesis for this parlay. What I've been coming down hard on is this idea that games kind of don't revolve around an ideal complexity to depth exchange for their gameplay. And I think games get into a lot of trouble when they try to not do that, or I think they often just don't think about this. It's not that they're consciously trying to get away with it, because you would know it wouldn't work if you thought about this. When a live service game adds more and more updates like this, you're suggesting that it would make sense to keep it more simple to begin with, and then add complexity as you go. I do not agree with this. I would argue that live service games or ongoing games are largely just dead in the water for this design idea, and it's amazing how good some are, despite largely forfeiting the ability to do game design, this part of game design. They will inevitably have a period where the game design would benefit a ton. The thing a lot of people would like about the game would be if it had more complexity, but it got a good deal on depth. And this design will go on to do that, but it starts out not doing that, less complex and with less depth. For a little while, it will increase that. At some point, it will get to a point where the design really makes sense. Adding all this space for mods or, upgrades for your character or a number of party members in your party makes sense. And it will hit that point. And at that point, the design is at its strongest. Again, many games just do this as a tutorializing process or to ease you into the game. But in an ongoing game, there's often periods where those points you ease into literally don't exist. And so for a little while, the game is just the simple parts that would set up good trades for complexity to depth, but they just don't yet. And so then the game gets to that point, and then it just keeps right on going, sacrificing almost immediately the good compromise between those two things. Again, in many cases, it's like, what are you supposed to do? In the real world where you need to make money, you might be thinking, how can you make a game that doesn't do this? But they do exist. There are games that don't constantly move and sit at a good compromise or a good equilibrium of those elements for a while, for a long time, or even forever on private servers. This is a thing that happens, and they often make money, but if they want to make all of the money, because money, they will often just keep going. And I'm sure this isn't a hard sell for most people nowadays. If you insist that the game needs to grow forever and make more money, more money forever, obviously at some point it will just break. All I'm trying to say is I'm extending that idea to say there is a point at which it was at its most complete or sensible, a range, not an exact moment, but a range in which it was at its most complete, and being a live service or ongoing game, it will inevitably abandon that point, which is obviously bad. At the same time, I question the value, except in market cap, of the game, like not just starting at that point, right? That I feel that's kind of the same claim. It's just like saying, when your game that you like, that's an ongoing or live service game, is the way you like it, do you want it to continue until it destroys itself? You would say, obviously no. And then if I said, okay, well, also, what if I were to turn back time and we start the game when it's only 50% of the way you like it? Would you rather me do that? You would say, no, right? Why? And the answer is because of money. And some people will maybe get into the game when it's like that, sure. I guess I just feel like a lot of games and a lot of culture in general is very heavily couched in the dubious idea that people will follow along with something and therefore it will be really good, like for the people who were there from the start, which I feel like many games or people haven't fully understood is like not that many people. There's not that many people that are having like that intended experience, if you will. So suggesting that there's like some big benefit to being in there from the start like that doesn't really fly to me. I don't fully agree. I feel like that is overrated at the very least, let's say. And that designing the game to just like be good makes way more sense. Personally, I feel like for ongoing games, there is a way you can kind of do it. That would be a topic for another time, but if you put your mind to it, you could probably respond to this information. And it's just that most people motivated to make an ongoing game or a live service game don't care about this that much. That's why they were willing to make an ongoing or live service game that they know will destroy its own design down the line, right? The people concerned about this didn't agree to work on such a game for the most part. So there could be a very easy way for these games to have their cake and eat it too. And it could still be that very few games do it, simply because the people who care about that kind of thing are not working on those games for the most part. And so there could be a really good trend that I highly doubt will happen, where live service games will like let themselves exist at their stable moment somehow. Again, I sort of doubt it. If you were to ask me more about this, one thing I would talk about is Arknights has a mode where you kind of like level up your account again in a relatively long per run, but like, 1 hour at the most, roguelike mode. It's really fun, I believe, where an Arknights is at its kind of best balance, is when you have a few units all the way leveled up and you're carefully picking which one to level up next and carefully employing support units from an ally. But there's also some drawbacks to doing that, so you're doing that carefully. And you've got each role, and you have a few units in each role that are doing their job. You have the tools. Arknights does a very good job of just giving those to you. But you're kind of managing, building up your account's power like that. There is a roguelike game mode in Arknights forever that is not a limited time event or costs any money to play that I highly recommend you play and just ignore the game's gacha system. You can do that pretty much. That basically is this. It basically re-downgrades your units only in the context of that roguelike mode, and then you can kind of mini upgrade them as you go throughout the game mode, therefore sort of encapsulating that moment where I think the game systems are at their best or most meaningful, and the trade-offs between units make the most sense, or really the only time they make any sense. Because once you have everything leveled up, you can just use whatever you think is the most effective or fun for the situation. And that thinking kind of is gone now. And when you're at the beginning of the game, you just have to level whatever you have. You only have one option in many cases, so you just have to use that. There's a period in the middle of the game, inherently transient, even if the game wasn't a live service or an ongoing game, as you level your account to progress through the game's missions. You would need to level past this point, but it would be really good if you could kind of hold on to that, and they actually did do that. So that would be you can do this, and there are successful games that do it, none of which are coming to my mind other than Arknights, but I'm sure there are a few others somewhere, maybe. Putting a roguelike in your existing live service ongoing game is a short summary of the elevator pitch for what I'm suggesting here, but you would want to go about it in a different way than just doing that. I could see that not working in a lot of such games. The roguelike is about retroactively building up your account on a speedrun, not about just adding way more things to the thing you already have. That could be fun, but that doesn't accomplish the goal I'm describing. Okay, cool. So how would your answer change depending on the expected lifespan of ongoing support for a game? It basically wouldn't, but I explained what I meant by that in a lot of detail. Both game DLC editions, there was more, you mentioned, to Against the Storm and Reyes 2, have added game pieces which are alternatives to ones in the base game, which have both higher skill floor, that is, the minimum skill required to actually make use of them is higher, their minimum complexity to use them is higher, and ceiling, the benefit you can get from using them in an intelligent way is higher, with a higher power ceiling and lower power floor to match. That is, if you don't use them well, then you don't get as much of a benefit, but you get a lot of bit of a benefit if you use them well. For a skilled player, this means that difficult content actually becomes easier, as the new options are stronger when piloted properly. How do we feel about that way of navigating challenge in a single-player game? Should more complex pieces power creep the maximum possibilities to encourage engagement with those more interesting mechanics? People may not engage with something harder without an appropriate reward, or should a game dev aiming for balance try and keep power ceilings flat across all options, knowing that adding new content will often result in power creep anyway, as new synergies slip through? And again, my answer is, the ideal is that you don't add any stuff to the game, that you encapsulate the moment where the balance makes sense. You do the balance with all the pieces all together, and then you leave it alone. Or, alternatively, you plan to add DLC, but you planned to add it from the start, so it's balanced all together with the things that you had from the start. Again, I suspect that many people have rejected many of the arguments in this parlay because money, and I keep saying that myself, but I want to make at least some effort, as I just did with Arknights, to point out that many successful people actually do this. I'm not just saying pedantically, like, in a perfect meditation plane, you could, in theory, balance this all out better, but nobody will ever actually do that. No, like, they do, just not very often. And I legitimately think it's mostly because people don't think to do it, not because you, like, really can't that badly. Just as a simple example, Brandon Sanderson, writing his big interconnected fantasy, but kind of sci-fi, we're not going to get into it right now, Cosmere series, is currently writing a set of his Mistborn series, the Era 3 books. If you read the Cosmere, this is Ghostbloods. He's writing all 3 books first, then editing them all together for continuity, and then releasing them one after another. Now, you might say, well, he can do that because he's like pretty much the top-selling fantasy author right now, and one of them, certainly one of them of all time. But that's not entirely true. He did originally do that with the original Mistborn trilogy, some of his earlier published books, and really the foundation of the Cosmere as we know it today, in my opinion. So, and he's also done Mistborn Era 2, where he didn't do this and says he kind of regretted it. And so now he's doing it again. And you could try to give people other examples. Again, I'm not really trying to prove that this is super feasible or anything. I'm just making the point that it's not as if nobody has done this. And I'm also giving you a practical example. There are very successful games and other media that do the thing I'm describing, that balance everything. The balance of the abilities and like the metals in allomancy is one of the big things in the Mistborn trilogy. The Mistborn trilogies, I should say. it helps a lot to be able to do it all at once. And so, to some extent, I believe there is a place here where you can have your cake and eat it too. Rather than letting more complex pieces power creep the maximum possibilities to encourage engagement with those more interesting mechanics, or the developer aiming to keep balance flat, knowing adding new content will often result in power creep anyway, you can have adding new content not result in power creep anyway by just having thought about that from the start. I mean, there are examples where it kind of drives me slightly mad. When Limbus Company first launched, like, if you read the units that were in the game, it's not really rocket science that, like, if you were gonna add more units, you would add this, that, and the other thing. And yet it was a little weird to see that the people launching this live service game, an ongoing game that they knew was going to need to get updates for like a year or two, even if it failed really hard. Gacha games that fail really hard often last like a year or two before going out of service. So there's really no doubt. I mean, and they already had money, like they were a previously established developer. And the financial situation with Project Moon is really interesting, but topic for another time. They had money, okay? There isn't really any reason why you wouldn't plan the characters you were going to release for like 2-ish years. But it felt like mere months after the game released, they had absolutely no idea what to add, and basically just learned how to develop the game they just spent several years, developing after the game was completely complete, causing them to need to like retcon the game's core mechanics. And there's constantly things in Limbus Company where a mechanic comes up in a new released chapter, and it's a really good idea for that part of the game, which we somehow didn't realize for 4 or 5 years of developing, releasing, and marketing this game. So now it's all over the place, all over the game. And it's really kind of a shame that somehow that didn't like come up before. You might be saying, well, they just didn't think of it first. But I'm telling you, if you were to look at a lot of these things, I don't really buy that you would somehow not have thought of that before. It kind of feels like they just didn't do character or design space development until right before they were going to launch the game. And then as a consequence, they realized all this stuff after the fact. That just doesn't really make that much sense. I mean, the combat system isn't even that different from their previous games. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make by saying that, I'm sorry, Limbus Company, there's lots of really cool design. In a way, it's a really, really interesting game to play for that specific intellectual interest. The point I'm trying to make is just that I think this seems harder than it sounds because developers don't do it. Not because it's like really that hard to just like project a little bit. What will the game's design space maybe want to be like? If players can clash attacks in Limbus Company, and if they win the clash, they do not get hit by the attack and they hit with their own attack back. If there comes a time when players can clash attacks consistently, they will take no damage. So you probably want a way for the enemy to do some damage to them, even if they win the clash. I don't know, like an attack where if you beat them in a clash, they still hit you after you're done with your attack, but they do less damage. And would you look at that, if you play Limbus Company, this is unbreakable coins, which are now all over the game after being somehow not invented for like 3 years of the game releasing. That does not make any sense. That's something that you could definitely conclude using this mindset before the game launched. In fact, how that wasn't how the game was conceived doesn't entirely make sense to me. But I don't know. I'm certainly not that kind of game developer. I don't know what I count as for now. It's been very interesting, let's just say. I'm still really enjoying all of Limbus Company. In a way, it's that it has changed in my rhetoric in this parlay through being many different games, and I just happen to be interested in all of them. But that's not like very good design. From a design perspective, it's a hot mess, and it's shocking that it is as kind of sensibly calibrated as it is, but it's not really. I don't know, it's not. I just think a lot of this stuff really isn't that much of a problem, and you need to understand that you and I, listener, we exist in a place where we're spending hours of our free time talking about specifically build systems. Almost all career game developers spend less time thinking about making builds, thinking about making build systems than I do, and probably than you do, actually. And so it makes sense that a lot of professional have made games. This is their job. They're the best in the business at this. Game developers are actually not very good at doing this thing that we, not shipped game developers, would maybe actually be better at this aspect of game design. The industry as a whole has not been digging into this very much. There's not very many good examples. The thing I learned in the past few years making videos on the Zandy Pants and Bootleg Builds channels is that you cannot make a video series about build system game design, because from a common consensus game design conversation perspective, that topic doesn't exist currently. There are a few developers that like kind of dig into it, but it basically just isn't there. I'm not taking any credit for this. I mean, games from decades ago have like invented the concept of a build system. That's not what's happening here. I'm just saying that a lot of games have fallen very far off the wagon, at least, or we never really codified any of that learning at the worst with this subject. Dungeons and Dragons, has a involved perspective of developers that understand things about build systems, but not in a way that has been extrapolated to other games. And that's not very hard to do for how big of a benefit it would have, considering that it hasn't been done, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That is one of the major goals of my career. By the time I am done, that will not be true anymore, but we got a long way to go. The point is, to answer your topic in a more coherent way, what you're asking is if the game adds pieces which are alternatives to the ones in the base game pieces, game options, which have a higher skill floor and a higher skill ceiling with a higher power ceiling to match, lower power floor to match. Do we just let that happen, basically? My answer is mostly no. I think that having it be that there are pieces that are harder to make use of in the game, but they provide a bigger benefit, is a problem inherently, because it means the game is rewarding you getting into that. The real level of complexity of the game is that level of complexity at that point. I feel that the better model is to focus it more on specific or general pieces, and have it be that sometimes for a piece to be generally powerful, the generalist pieces are weaker, the specific pieces are stronger. If you want to make a stronger piece, then you can make it a generalist and have the skill floor be higher. It's a generalist that works a lot of the time, but it takes more effort to use. So you can pick what kind of effort you want to exert. You can learn the generalist piece, or you can use a specific piece. If you want to, you can also take a less powerful piece that also isn't hard to use, but it will be that generalist piece. So you can choose to get your power by going for a specific strategy, or by learning a piece that is harder to use, but both of those things have the same peak in terms of power. Then there are also more generalist pieces that are easier to use but less powerful. And from there you have pieces that are hard to use and powerful a lot of the time, pieces that are easy to use but are only powerful some of the time, and then pieces that are easy to use but are as good as they are all the time, they're just worse than those other two things. And so the player can pick, and you can make more than this, of course, if you create different roles in the game. This can amount to quite a few different characters. If we were to look at something like Arknights, you could draw this out and see that alone, with 8 different classes and roles, and you need to generate deployment points and block enemies and still heal your units, can easily add up to 3 of those for each of those roles is 24 if you don't need any different kinds of those roles, and then if you give units different ranges and stuff. I feel it's better to pull those different development knobs and make more pieces that are separate, but in a way equal to each other, rather than pieces that are like just better, but it's harder to use them. I really feel like this is something that the industry's gotten kind of lazy with. The idea that, oh, for some players, like, this is just easier and it's fine. It's kind of hard to make something have a genuinely higher skill ceiling in a way that matters in the 21st century. So I personally feel like rather than leaving it to chance, your player just likes this or that unit, or decides they're going to put this or that amount of time or effort into the game, and then the game's balance just like completely changes. I feel like it's better to just balance it in niches and say the player can use the more involved strategies or not, and doing so they can kind of cash in where they want their effort. Do you want to build around a strategy? Do you want to put a lot of effort into the unit you're using? Or do you want to just try really hard when you're in the mission, but use generalist pieces that don't require any of those other two things? So That would be my answer. Now, I'm sure what you want me to say is, what if I hold a gun to your head and say, you need to add more complex pieces? How do you want to power creep them? I would say definitely making them be more involved to use is better than making them less involved to use. Sure, but I just still think it's bad. Maybe you could have it be that you unlock that stuff later. It involves more knowledge of the mechanic, and so the complexity is going up, but you're trying to stay in that gradient where the game's depth like kind of works, and so you just put that maybe later in the game. Or again, DLC that can be sort of in addition to the end of the game is a very powerful way to kind of sidestep a lot of these issues, because in theory you're benefiting the players that are already interested in the game as it is. The problem with live service games, these ongoing experiences will often leave behind the previous simple version of the game. They do add the DLC to the end, but the problem is, as time goes on, the beginning of the game that had that lower complexity often erodes away, and so you actually increased the overall difficulty to complexity to depth. Difficulty has been breaking my brain for this entire conversation, because it's kind of like complexity as a word and kind of like depth as a word. It's like itty difficulty, but then it's also D like depth, and that is destroying my mind right now somehow, because I've said those words way too much. They probably don't sound really you anymore. Complexity, depth. To me, complexity sounds very fake now. Anyway, that's what I have to say. It's bad, and I feel like the more meaningful way to say this is not to say obviously power creep is bad, or obviously it's better to add the power creep to the end of the game, which I feel like are both just obvious, and to instead explain, I think you can do neither and have it be better, and here's how I think you can do neither and have it be better. But yes, if you had to, I do think, yes, like, you power creep the maximum possibilities, but just try to do it at the end. And again, have it be that the skill requirement is higher. Rewarding some skill by giving the player more power is something our culture is very happy with, but I, as a game developer, am pretty suspect about. I don't think that's actually engaging with whether that is what the design is about. You're kind of making the game about something else, which will often not fly for people with the standards to care about this, that wanted what the game was about in the first place. The game asked them for a certain amount of skill, and they may not be down for more or less, and that's not bad or ignoble. Our culture tends to look down on this idea that you don't think it's inherently good to get more skilled, but why? I mean, no, it's not. Like, if it provides some benefit, then I might be willing to make that exchange. But why is it good to just dump effort into something because it's insisted that you need to? Like, it's not. It's good if there's a reward you want for that effort. And I don't think that the reward being that the difficulty of the game is increased, so if you want to like a different game where you put more complexity in and get out more depth, then you could engage with the rest of the game. But if not, this secretly isn't the game that you bought DLC for. This is a different game that we just insist on calling the same game. That's not good, according to me. And I think when you put it that way, that's not that controversial, but go figure. So that would be my answer. I know I took what looked on paper like a simple short parlay and made it into a very long one, but believe it or not, this is actually the second take, and I think this is a very complicated subject that warrants a lot of discussion, so I hope you enjoyed the way I discussed it. I tried really hard with this one to explain what I meant, because I think that my opinion about a lot of these subjects is probably not familiar to a lot of people, and so I thought I probably can't take, even as I normally don't take much for granted in these and explain a lot, I tried to do that a lot more exhaustively this time. So I hope that went okay. Thank you for the parlay. I really liked this one, if you can't tell. There's a lot of parlay I'd want to do off of this. Folks, if you'd like to join us for Parlay, you can do that using the link in the description. We'd love to have you. It's like a monthly subscription service where you have me spend some time chewing on a thought that you thought was interesting, and I make you a video about it like this. It can be about whatever you want. It can have these direct questions. You could just talk about something you like and I'll respond. There's also been a lot of other weirder ones. I don't know, have me explain the joke like an old folk from the older generations, and give me a meme or something. That's perfectly fine too. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.